Well, those of you that are here will get a closure on the Old Testament study. I believe Nathan Davis, while I was gone on one Sunday afternoon, he said that I was supposed to give a summary and a closeout on the Old Testament series. And you may have thought that we were already past that, but here we are, and we will officially close it. I do want to say, in light of the Old Testament study that we did, it took about 3 years. A lot of those sermons are on the YouTube page. Most of them are recorded. Some of them, we were still going through the glitches of, I was training certain people to help me out with the recorder, and some of those didn't get recorded, and most of them did. But there's a folder on the website that has the Old Testament series, and you can go back and review those particular studies of interest to you. In this study, I actually gave this to you as an introduction to that Old Testament series 3 years ago. So I'm going to give you the same study. I'm just going to go through it quickly, and it's just hopefully now a review for you, as before you didn't really know the Old Testament story maybe. Well, now you do, and this will help you put the pieces together like a puzzle. So in this study, I want to give you the 14 biblical periods that if you were to pinpoint these periods in the Bible and the Old Testament, you would be able to capture the essence of what's going on historically from Genesis to Malachi. And so for each, what we're going to do is for each biblical period, I'm going to give you the name of it. It's actually up here on the board. And then we're going to give a short theme for that period to sum it up, and then a biblical verse from a historical book within that period. There's at least one historical book that captures each period in the Bible. And by that I mean like books like Samuel and Chronicles and Genesis are books of history, whereas books like Psalms and Song of Solomon, they're not books of history. And while they might have been written during a certain period, they don't capture it like if you were reading a history book. And so that's what makes part of getting the Old Testament story difficult, is that not all the books of the Old Testament are of the same literary genre, and they're also not arranged chronologically in our English Bible arrangement. Neither are they in the Jewish Bible arrangement, but that's beside the point. Now let's go ahead and get started here, and we'll just breeze through this. This is a visual chart. Maybe you'll recall this if you heard the first study. I created a little visual so you could see each period and something about it that maybe will maintain in your memory. Sometimes people learn visually, so I tried to create this a while back for you guys. What I'll do is I'll put that visual up on the screen for that particular period, like creation. So the Bible starts, and the story of the Jews start in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis, chapters 1 through 5. And the very first verse in the Bible, I think, captures this period the best. In the beginning was the heavens and the earth. And that is, just right into it. Moses starts telling about the creation of the world. What a better place to start. And that's covered in the first verse all the way through the end of chapter 1 of Genesis. After each day, God would say, and it was good. In each 6 days of creation, he would create whatever, and he would say, and it was good. And that's how the Bible story starts out. It was good. There was nothing bad about it. But it doesn't take but 3 chapters in for things to not be good. And that's, of course, whenever Eve takes of the forbidden fruit and gives it to Adam, and they eat it, and then sin enters the world. Like a cancer, it spreads. And in only 5 chapters, what was good has become awfully bad, bringing us to the flood period, the second period in biblical history. So whereas Genesis was about beginnings, or I should say the creation period was about beginnings, that's the theme of that period, the flood period is about judgment, followed by a new creation, as it were. This has summed up kind of the condition that the world had gotten to in the Bible chapters, not long. But this was over the course of several hundred, maybe even 1,000 years. It says in Genesis 6 verse 5 that then the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thought of his hearts was only evil continually. Now that's a little hyperbole. I suppose that even the most wicked people have some good thoughts, like they get hungry and they think about what to eat. Well, that's not an evil thought, but he's exaggerating to get the point across how bad things have gotten from the point of how good things were. And that's when God decides we're going to have to start over. One translation, I think the King James says that God repented that he had made man. Well, he destroys with the flood, you'll remember through Noah, And Noah and his 3 sons and their wives and family get on the ark. And after they get off the ark, a lot of the same language that's used in the creation and the Garden of Eden, God uses again to describe what's made new whenever this refurbished, renewed earth from the flood washing all the evil away. And so it's like a fresh start. And so we go again. But 5 chapters later, things are getting bad again. Things are getting so bad again that if God doesn't intervene, it's going to be the flood 2.0. That brings us to Genesis chapter 11 and what is called the scattering of the people. Oh, I'm sorry. I've not been staying up to speed with you. Okay, that's the flood. The scattering of the people. And you'll recognize this as the Tower of Babel. That's a visual rendition of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. The theme of this period is the creation of the nations. And we can presume from what's told in this period in Genesis 11 that God intervenes in order to slow the progress of sin slower than it got in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 5. Now, the world's pretty bad today, and you might think, well, we're reaching the end. And a lot of people are saying that. And maybe we are reaching the end. I'm not saying we're not. I'm not saying we are. But the point is, I believe here that God intervenes to slow down the what do they call that? The spread of sin. And it says there in Genesis chapter 11, verse 8, so the Lord scattered them abroad from over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. And so the spread of sin and corruption is slowed by this confusing of the people's tongues. You can imagine this is where cultures are introduced, and different cultures explode, different languages, different potentially skin colors. I don't know. There's a lot that we don't really know, but I imagine that all those things have their beginnings here in the book of beginnings. Well, anyways, those people spread. They go different places. The Bible says that in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. And maybe that was even the continental divide. I don't know. But nonetheless, these people go different places. And one of those people, or peoples, is Nahor. And Nahor, he's living somewhere in what is now the land of, it's the Middle East. He's living somewhere in the Middle East, I'll say like that. And he's the father of Abraham. And this guy Abraham, he is not like his family. His family worships idols in Genesis chapter 11, toward the end it says. But Abraham's not like his family. And God calls Abraham, and that brings us to what's called the patriarchs. And Abraham is the first of the patriarchs. Patriarch just means father. And so God begins to call on Abraham and his sons after him as the patriarchs, the fathers of what will be the nation of Israel, to make them a special people. And the key verse in this period is Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And it says there, now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, from your father's house, to a land that I'll show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. I thought that teachers did a good job of reminding us of the 3 things that God promised Abraham. And maybe you're thinking in your head. One was land. You just read it. One was nation. They would be a great nation. One was a blessing. They would be a blessing to all the earth. And they would be a blessing to all the earth through a seed that would come through Abraham. And that would, of course, be the Messiah. We'll find out. But they didn't know that, who specifically it would be in their time. Well, anyways, Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. God comes down and wrestles with Jacob and changes his name to Israel. Israel has 12 sons, and those 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. And there's the beginnings now of the real story, you might think, that covers most of the rest of the Old Testament. And now we have, after the patriarchs, Joseph is taken to Egypt. He would be one of the patriarchs. He's taken to Egypt, and that's because of a famine. All the children of Israel go to live in Egypt. And they find themselves all living in Egypt in Exodus chapter 1. And that brings us to the Exodus, the 5th biblical period. That kind of sums up Exodus chapters 1 through 15. They got so large in number that it intimidated the Pharaoh of Exodus chapter 1 to think we need to put a stop to the multiplication of this people. And they become slaves in Egypt. There's a little bit of racism involved there, and they become slaves in bondage, heavy bondage. And God calls the Israelites through Moses. And Exodus chapter 6, verse 5, captures God's calling of the people and the condition that they're in. It says in Exodus 6 and verse 5, "And I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel, whom the Egyptians keep in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as a heritage. I am the Lord." The key phrase there in verse 6, "I will redeem you." And in a few short chapters later, in chapter 12, God will redeem. He will buy back his people through deliverance in the Red Sea. And he redeems them through this physical act of deliverance from the Egyptian bondage that they were in. This is the greatest act of redemption in the Old Testament. I say that carefully. It's the greatest act of redemption in the Old Testament until a certain event in Golgotha in the New Testament. It will be heavily alluded to by the Jews in their writings throughout the Old Testament. A couple of things that are heavily alluded to. If you pay attention, if you read from Genesis to Malachi, you will consistently find the prophets alluding back to the Exodus as God's calling his people and redeeming them. You will also hear the prophets calling back to the calling of Abraham and a promise of land, nation, and blessing. And if you pay attention, those two themes are very heavily influenced in the writers of Isaiah and Ezekiel and Zechariah and others. Well, anyways, they get through the Red Sea and they come into the wilderness of sin, appropriately named. And the people there begin to be tried in the wilderness by hunger and by thirst and by wanting to go back to the land of Egypt. And they start reminiscing about the good old terrible days back there, where everything was better than what they're feeling at the moment. Well, they get up to, in the book of Numbers, they are camped at the border of the land that God had promised to Abraham, and you think they're about to make it in. And so God sends 12 spies to go in for 40 days and to spy out the land. Those spies come back, only 2 of them come back with good reports, Caleb and Joshua. And 10 of them represent most of the people by coming back and saying, these people are too big for us. There's no way that we can take these people. And so God says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make y'all roam in this wilderness for 40 years, for a day, or a year for every day that those unfaithful spies were in the land of Canaan. And that's what happens until that generation dies out, physically dies out. And there's no more complainers left. I shouldn't say that. There's still complainers, just not the original complainers and the original unfaithful. A verse that captures this period, which the theme of it would be God's education of his people, I think is a good name for it, God's education of his people. In Numbers 14, verse 29, the Bible says this: "The carcasses of you who have complained against me shall fall in this wilderness, all of you who were numbered according to your entire number, from 20 years old and above, except for Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. You shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. This is jumping down to verse 34. According to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days for each day you will bear your guilt, 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection." And so they're in the wilderness period, being tested over and over by God. Are they going to be just his people, or will he also be their God? That's the question. That's the thing they're being educated on. Finally, they get back to the border of Canaan, where they first had an opportunity to capture the land that God promised to Abraham. They're back at the border. And finally, this time, they renew the covenant through Moses, and they go in with the leadership of Joshua. And they conquer the land. They do. They conquer all of the land. They don't drive out every single inhabitant like God told them to do, but territorially, they do conquer the land, and this is called the conquest period. And Joshua chapter 21, I think, sums up this period, the theme being Israel claiming their inheritance. Joshua 21, at the end of the conquering of the land, it says this in verse 43. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Not a word failed. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass. That's a very important passage to highlight in your Bible. God fulfilled what he said he would do to the Israelites that day. And so they conquered the land, and for a period, there's, great joy. But as often is the case in the books of the Old Testament, the joy doesn't last too long because of the people. And shortly they will reject God for the idols in the land and to be like the peoples around them. And that leads us to one of the darkest times in their history, the Judges period. The Judges period. Some of the most fantastic stories in this period, but not for the right reasons. And this is kind of the theme of this period is there was no king in Israel. There was no king in Israel. The Bible will say repeatedly at the end of the book. Judges chapter 17 verse 6 repeats that refrain. Judges chapter 3, though, kind of sums up in one kind of short story, the cycle of sin, the people's rejection of God. And then after God would lead them into captivity by some oppressor in the land, they would call out to God, and God would listen and have mercy on them, and they would return to God only to reject him again. And that cycle would go over and over in this period. Notice Judges chapter 3, verse 7. And I'm going to read through verse 11. Judges chapter 3 and verse 7. It says, So the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and Asherahs. Therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them in the land of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the children of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. When the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the children of Israel, who delivered them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord delivered Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. So the land had rest for 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. And in that one story, you have about 20 of those in this book, where this people rejecting God and coming back to God through deliverance. Finally, by the way, I read a book earlier this year that tried to make the case that Judges was actually a high point in Israel's history, and it was actually not a state of depravity of the nation. It was the most fantastic thing I've ever read or heard. Nonetheless, this is not a high point in the nation of Israel. This is one of the worst times of their history's narrative. That leads us to the United Kingdom period. As they go through this period, there was no king in Israel, and this seems to be setting up the story for the first king in Israel, Saul, followed by David and Solomon. And at this point, all of the tribes are united under a king's rule, and the nation experiences its highest level of success in the whole story of the Old Testament. The theme of this period is the glory of the kingdom of Israel, and a passage that captures it is in 1 Kings chapter 4 in the reign of Solomon. Notice the language of 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 24 about Solomon's reign. Referring to Solomon, it said, For he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river from Tiphsah even to Gaza, namely over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on every side all around him. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Now, the geography that he lists there of Solomon's domain is parallel and exact to the geography that God promised to Abraham. And so here again, the Bible is telling us that God has fulfilled his promise to Abraham by giving them the land, making them a great people, and they're experiencing the height of glory and safety as a nation under the king who follows God. Well, that doesn't take long to die out. They experienced a few good years, And finally, this united kingdom becomes a divided kingdom under Solomon's son Rehoboam. He's not a very good leader, and the people rebel. This is a period defined by covenant unfaithfulness by Israel. And this rebellion is summed up in 1 Kings chapter 12 in verse 16. It says there, this is during Rehoboam's reign and the coup led by Jeroboam. Now when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, "What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel! Now see to your own house, O David!" And the people flee, and only Judah remains with King Rehoboam. Only that tribe, Judah, Benjamin, and some Levites. And the rest of them all politically rebel, and there is now a divide in the kingdom. And it's 10 tribes to the north and 2 tribes faithful to David's house in the south. And this parallel history will continue for several hundred years, for a couple hundred years at least, for a while. That brings us to a point where the 10 tribes in the north, they end up being taken captive by the Assyrians, because they had, as bad as most of the leaders in Judah were, the leaders in Israel were that much worse. They declined much faster, and eventually God would put them into the hands of the Assyrians, bringing us to the period known as Judah alone. The Assyrians come and they capture the nations, the 10 tribes in the north. That's summed up in 2 Kings chapter 17. Notice with me 2 Kings 17 and verse 5. Now the king of Assyria went throughout all the land and went up to Samaria. That's the capital of the northern tribes. He went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, he took Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria and placed them in Hala and by the river, or by the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the city of the Medes. So there's the captivity. 2 Kings 17 and 18 sums that up. In verse 18 of 2 Kings 17, it says, "Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel. He removed them from his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah alone." And that's where we get the name of this period. Judah is left alone. And they'll continue for some time. They will be back and forth, faithful to God, unfaithful to God, bringing us to a time where they also become so depraved that God sends Babylon to capture them. And this is known as the captivity period. This is not to be confused with the Assyrian captivity. This captivity period refers to the Babylonian captivity of Judah. A passage that sums up this period, a theme that captures it, would be God's judgment on Judah. 2 Kings chapter 25 says this in verse 8. "And in the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord and the king's house, all the houses of Jerusalem, that is, all the houses of the great, he burned with fire. And all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls of Jerusalem all around." There's 2 things noted there that are of import to the Jews. He destroyed the national symbol of God dwelling with his people, the temple, and he also destroyed the wall which protected the city and the temple. And so these people did not have God dwelling with them. That was confirmed by the temple's destruction, and they had no protection from enemy with the walls torn down. That's the state of Israel as they are now in foreign land. And that continues under not only the Babylonian Empire, but the Medo Empire that succeeds that, until we get to King Cyrus, the first king of the Medo-Persian Empire. And he decides he's a lot more friendly to foreign religions that they capture in the Persian Empire, and he decides to let the Jews return to the land, those who want to. So that's where Zerubbabel comes in, and Ezra, and eventually Nehemiah, and they take 3 caravans of Jews back to Jerusalem, and they start rebuilding the temple. Zerubbabel starts rebuilding the temple, Ezra finishes rebuilding the temple, and Nehemiah builds the walls back that we talked about were broken down by Nebuzaradan. So this is a physical restoration of Israel. That's the theme of this period. In Ezra chapter 2 and verse 1 it says, "Now these are the people of the province who came back from the captivity of those who had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away to Babylon, and who returned to Jerusalem and Judah, everyone to his own city." Everyone to his own city. The people are physically back in the land. The problem is, you can be physically somewhere, but spiritually on vacation. And so they were. And at the end of Nehemiah and the end of Ezra, both of these construction workers, these contract leaders, if you want to call them, they give a spiritual lesson to the people, and they try to renew the covenant. But these people, by and large, do not maintain spiritual fidelity to God, and they remain spiritually empty. And they will remain spiritually empty for about 400 years, from the time that passes between Malachi all the way to John the Baptist. We find him in Matthew chapter 3. A passage that kind of sums up the anticipation of this silent period is Malachi chapter 3. And it says here in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 1, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Even the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts." There is an anticipation of preparing the way for the Messiah. And they realize they need a Messiah. And during this silent period, you would see the rise of certain sects. In the days of Jesus, you hear of the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Herodians, the Zealots. All of these different sects of the Jews arise during the silent years in the Grecian and the Roman Empire. And that brings us to the days of Jesus and John, where the Messiah has finally come. But as an Old Testament story, that's where the Old Testament story is. And so that's a quick summary, 14 biblical periods. There they are for you to see all of them together. Now, I would point you to a couple of resources if you're interested. On my website, if you'll go to Bible series, there's a 14-lesson series called What You Need to Know About the Old Testament. And that was back in the day when I wrote actually 5-minute articles. And you can read each one of those in 5 minutes, and it covers each period in the Old Testament. And it covers more than what I covered. It's completely different than what I covered tonight. So you could learn more by reading that series. You can go back and watch the videos. There's also I created a Bible periods matching game where you can print it off and you can try to match the period with a certain feature, a character from that period, or I think it's maybe, I don't know what else. But you can give yourself a little exercise to see if you know what goes to each period. You can also go to my YouTube page on 5-Minute Bible Study, and tonight or tomorrow I'm going to release this presentation that I gave on a video. It's going to be a lot cleaner than what I just gave, and it's going to be a lot, hopefully, easy to follow than what I just gave. So you can follow that along as well if you want to revisit the Old Testament story. With that said, that is going to be the end of our Old Testament study, and I've enjoyed it a lot, and I hope that you have as well. Well, one of the things, I guess if I was to call our attention to the need to be saved and the need to repent, I would bring attention to the fact that in the New Testament, the church, if you were to look at these 14 biblical periods, the church is placed in the wilderness period by James and by Peter and by other writers in the Old Testament or New Testament. They will allude to the idea that the church is in the wilderness. They are dispersed in the days of the apostles. They are being tested. They're under fire. And there is this call for perseverance and to maintain faithfulness to God. We're in that period today. And you may not think of it like that, but that's how the New Testament authors described where we are today. It's like we're in that 40-year wilderness wandering, and God's calling us to be faithful to Him, and He's testing us. He's allowing us to be tried by enemies and by those who do not believe the gospel, and they persecute our faith. If you feel pressure, that's because that's where we're at in the story. And so this is to bring our attention to the present day. If you have been unfaithful to God and you've complained you need to make that right with God and maintain fidelity to Him, and this is your opportunity to do that. Thanks for watching this video. I know what you're thinking. I don't want to miss another video from this channel. In order to avoid that, click on the red button down there, subscribe, and then click the bell icon. Not only will that alert you each time a new video is uploaded to the channel, it will also help spread the channel to other people's awareness. So, go ahead, do it. Like right now, click on it.